silence in the farmhouse didn't feel peaceful after Eleanor passed. It felt heavy, like the air itself had solidified. Arthur Vance stood in the center of the kitchen, gripping a teaspoon he had no intention of using, his eyes fixed on the wicker chair by the window. That was where Eleanor had always possessed the morning light. The chair remained. The books remained. That was the cruelty of it. The world stayed exactly the same, while his entire universe had vanished. Sarah arrived from Chicago 3 days later. She had driven through a blinding rainstorm, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, her mind racing faster than the wipers. When she spoke to her father on the phone, his voice had been thin, brittle, like dry leaves skittering on pavement. Hold on just a moment before we continue. If this story is touching something in you, please take a second to like this video and subscribe. It genuinely makes a difference and helps me bring you more stories like this one. I also want to hear from you. Write in the comments, where are you right now? Are you tucked away in a peaceful village where stars fill the sky, or surrounded by the hum and glow of a city that never sleeps? When she pulled into the driveway, the porch light was burning, but Arthur wasn't there to wave her in. He was always there. Inside, the house carried the scent of stale tea and unopened windows. Arthur stood in the foyer, looking as though he had shrunk inside his wool cardigan. He held her, but the embrace was fragile. Sarah squeezed him tightly, feeling the tremor in his rib cage. There were no tears. Tears felt too small for a loss this size. The week following the service was a blur of casseroles and hushed conversations. Neighbors drifted in and out like tide water. Sarah nodded and thanked them, answering for Arthur, who seemed to be fading into the beige wallpaper. When the last car finally crunched down the gravel drive, the quiet rushed back in to claim the house. Sarah stayed on, calling her firm to take indefinite leave. No one questioned it. Mornings were the battlefield. Eleanor had been the conductor of mornings, the radio humming, the kettle whistling, the day planned before breakfast. Now, Arthur slept late, then sat at the oak table tracing the grain of the wood with his thumb. Sarah tried to fill the gaps. She baked. She tidied. She offered conversation when the silence got too loud and offered silence when words felt clumsy. One Tuesday, Sarah found her father in the mudroom clutching Eleanor's old tartan scarf. He wasn't crying. He was just breathing into the wool, trying to inhale a memory. Sarah backed away, unseen. She realized then that grief wasn't a storm you could weather. It was a fog that settled into your bones. 10 days later, a soft knock rattled the front door. Sarah opened it to find a woman standing on the welcome mat. She was tall, with silver hair cut in a sharp bob and eyes that held a steady, calming intelligence. "I'm Claire Bennett," she said, her voice low. "I sat on the library board with Eleanor for years." Sarah stepped aside. Claire didn't bustle in with forced cheer. She entered with reverence, as if the house were a church. When Arthur came around the corner, his expression shifted. It wasn't happiness, but it was a flicker of awareness. "Clamored," he murmured. "Arthur. I didn't want to intrude," she said. "But I wanted to bring this." She placed a heavy ceramic dish of lasagna on the counter. She offered no platitudes. She simply pulled out a chair and sat. Arthur sat opposite her. Slowly, haltingly, he began to speak about Eleanor's stubbornness regarding the library budget. Claire listened with an intensity that made Arthur sit a little taller. Sarah watched from the hallway. It didn't sting as she thought it might. It felt like someone had opened a window in a stuffy room. Claire wasn't trying to be Eleanor. She was just there. Claire began stopping by on Thursdays. She brought books, crossword puzzles, or sometimes just herself. She talked about her garden, her grown sons, her solitary life in the cottage down the lane. Arthur started to listen. Really listen. Sarah noticed the change, the way his shoulders dropped an inch, the way he actually finished a cup of coffee. Time marched on, indifferent to their loss. The trees stripped down to gray branches. The wind grew biting. Sarah took long walks, thinking about her mother. Eleanor had been a woman of motion, of action. She believed that the heart was a muscle that needed to be used, not protected. One evening, Arthur and Sarah sat on the back deck, wrapped in blankets against the chill. The sun was dipping below the tree line. "I don't know how to be this person," Arthur admitted, his voice barely audible. "Everything I did for her." Sarah looked at his hands that had built this deck, fixed her bicycle, held her world together. A panic rose in her throat. She was terrified that her father was preparing to exist rather than live. Claire's name floated into her mind, unbidden. Sarah leaned forward. The words that came out weren't planned, but they were necessary. She whispered a sentence that hung in the cold air, a permission slip signed with love and desperation. Arthur turned to her, eyes wide, caught between guilt and possibility. He didn't say a word. Sarah sat back, her heart hammering, wondering if she had pushed too hard. But the air between them had shifted. The stagnation was broken. Arthur didn't sleep that night. Sarah's whisper echoed in the dark. For the first time, the silence wasn't an accusation, it was a blank page. The next morning, Arthur was up before the sun. He made a full breakfast, eggs, toast, the works. He stood by the stove, the spatula feeling heavy but right in his hand. Sarah came down and saw him. She didn't make a big deal of it, but her smile was genuine. Arthur walked into town that afternoon. He passed the bakery, the post office, nodding to people who looked at him with that specific pity reserved for widowers. He walked until his lungs burned. He missed Eleanor with a physical ache, but the loneliness was starting to feel like a cage he wanted to break out of. Claire didn't visit for a week. Arthur found himself checking the driveway. When she finally pulled up, carrying a folder of old meeting minutes Eleanor had written, Arthur felt a nervous jump in his stomach. It terrified him. They sat in the living room. They looked at Eleanor's handwriting. Arthur laughed, a rusty, dry sound, at a margin note Eleanor had made. Claire smiled. I feel like a traitor. Arthur confessed, his voice cracking. Claire looked him dead in the eye. Joy isn't a betrayal, Arthur. It's a testament. That night, Arthur told Sarah about the visit. He didn't mention how good it felt to sit near someone who understood the silence. Sarah nodded, learning that sometimes loving your parents meant letting them grow away from you. Winter settled in hard. Snow blanketed the valley. Arthur and Claire began meeting for coffee in town, then for drives to watch the frozen lake. They didn't touch. The space between them was filled with respect and a tentative energy. One evening, Arthur voiced his deepest worry to Claire. People will think I've forgotten her. The people who matter know that's impossible. Claire replied softly. That night, Arthur dreamed of Eleanor. She wasn't sick. She was standing in the kitchen, humming, and when she looked at him, she didn't look sad. She looked expectant. Arthur woke up with wet cheeks, but a lighter spirit. Sarah saw the transformation. Her father shaved daily now. He hummed while he read the paper. It was a bittersweet healing. She missed her mother with a ferocity that took her breath away, but she refused to let her father bury himself alongside her. Sarah ran into Claire at the pharmacy a few days later. The air was awkward for a moment. You're remarkably strong, Claire said. I haven't done much. Sarah deflected. You opened the door, Claire said gently. You let him walk through it. Sarah drove home and finally let herself cry, a release she had been holding back for months. The turning point was Eleanor's birthday. Arthur had planned a dinner with Claire, but nearly called to cancel. He stood by the phone, trembling. Sarah walked into the kitchen. Go, she said. I don't know if I should, he replied. Mom wouldn't want you staring at the wall tonight. She'd want you to eat good food and tell stories. Arthur went. At the bistro, he and Claire talked for hours. The conversation flowed from politics to art to the strange reality of aging. When Arthur reached across the table to cover Claire's hand with his own, it wasn't a decision, it was a reflex. She didn't pull back. We have to go slow, Claire whispered. I know, Arthur said. But we are going? The town talked, of course. Small towns always do. But Arthur found he didn't care. For the first time since the funeral, he felt like a protagonist in his own life, not just a footnote in Eleanor's ending. Sarah struggled more than she let on. Seeing her father with a woman who wasn't her mother triggered a confusing mix of relief and resentment. She and Claire finally had a moment alone in the sunroom. I'm not trying to be her, Claire said, her voice steady. I know, Sarah said. It's just hard is, Claire agreed. We're all just figuring out the map as we go. Spring broke the winter's back. Crocuses poked through the thawing mud. Arthur was back in the garden, with Claire often weeding beside him. Sarah watched from the window, feeling a knot in her chest loosen. But life is rarely a straight line. Arthur collapsed one morning, a sudden dizziness, a pain in his arm. Sarah drove like a maniac to the ER. Claire met them there, pale and shaking. They sat in the waiting room, shoulder to shoulder. The hours dragged. When the doctor confirmed it was a minor cardiac event brought on by stress, but manageable, the relief in the room was palpable. Later, Arthur lay in the hospital bed, looking at Sarah and Claire standing together. The realization hit him with the clarity of a bell. Love hadn't been subtracted from his life, it had expanded. It had made room. I don't have forever, Arthur said, his voice raspy. I don't want to waste the time I have left. Claire squeezed his hand. Sarah wiped her eyes and nodded. Recovery was slow, but it brought honesty. Arthur asked Claire to be a real part of his life, out in the open. She agreed. Months later, Sarah packed her car for the return trip to Chicago. On her last night, the three of them shared a roast dinner. The house felt full. Different, yes. The echo of Eleanor was still there, but it was no longer a haunting. It was a foundation. As Sarah prepared to leave, Arthur and Claire stood on the porch, watching the taillights fade. Is this the right path? Arthur asked, looking at the woman beside him. Claire took his arm. It's the honest path. The house behind them was quiet, but it was no longer hollow. And somewhere beyond the grief, beyond the fear of forgetting, Arthur Vance finally allowed himself to believe that the heart is capable of writing a second chapter. Not by erasing the past, but by carrying it forward into the light.